Hello and welcome to my tutorial about single-celled organisms and how to feed them. I'm Frederik Steinmetz for cgtutsplus.com, and let's continue by creating the particles of our little guys. Okay, let's make some food for our little guy. Let's add a cube, Shift A and cube, scale it up, and there is a method to emit particles from the volume of the cube. So I'll add a particle system, call this food particles, and call the settings food, just to keep everything neat and tidy. And I want the particles to be emitted from the volume of the cube because I want to fill the entire cube with particles. So let's just see what happens. And this, of course, is not what we want. First of all, tab into edit mode and press Ctrl F to flip the normals, and that means that the direction of the particle is inverted because the normals now point inside. Let's see what happens now. Looks a lot better, but if you turn down the normal speed a little, you can see that even though it's set to volume, the particles will still not really fill the cube, but since this is not what we want, I'm going to use a different method for that. Delete this cube and add a plane. Move it over here, R and 90 to rotate it 90 degrees and scale it up, pressing S and moving your mouse. This plane will emit our particles, and for that we'll use the food particle system, and let's call this food particles. And I want to turn down the normal to 0, and you'll understand why in a minute. Now all our particles are emitted and they're traveling upwards because of our animated gravity. And let's change that because we don't want the particles to be affected by the gravity. We'll just set the gravity to 0. And also move the plane to layer 2 because we're applying force fields to it later on, and we don't want the force fields to affect our hair emitter system. And if the force fields are not on the same layer as the particle system, then or the particle emitter, then they won't affect the particles. Now let's go back to frame -20 and press I to set a keyframe for the location of the plane. Now let's move to frame number 1. Frame number 1 is Shift and back arrow, and press move the plane over here and press I for a location again. And you can see now from -20 to +1 our plane will travel across the screen. Right now it's accelerating at the beginning and decelerating at the end, and since we want our particles to be emitted continuously throughout the entire region that the plane will cover, we'll press A twice to make sure everything's selected, press Shift T and choose the interpolation mode linear. That will delete the keyframe handles, and our plane will not accelerate but have the same speed over the entire 21 frames. Now we don't need the keyframes in X and in Y and Z location, so it's a good idea to delete them. Press A until all are selected and delete the keyframes. The good thing about that is if we decide later on we want the particles to be emitted higher or lower, we can just change this, and since only the X location is keyframed, we can just move the plane in X and Y as much as we want to. Now we have, of course, we have to tell the particle system to start emitting at -19 and end emitting at frame 1. If we press Shift and back arrow now, you see Blender has already calculated the frames between -20 and 1, and this will be the initial state of our particle system. Maybe, so we can see it better, we'll turn down the particles to 200 for now, so we can have a much better overview what we're doing, and also it's computing faster. If we want the particles to not be static but wiggle, which is a lot more a lot more realistic underwater, and also it looks a lot better, we can turn up the Brownian force. The Brownian is just the diffusion of the particles. It will wiggle the particles. Let's put this up to 0.6 and see what happens. Our particles start to, well, there you go, life is way too short. I keep forgetting this, 500. And our particles will start wiggling. And as you can see, they are dispersing. And we want the particles to stay around our little animal because, first of all, we don't need to compute the particles that are too far away since the camera doesn't see them anyways, and also we don't want the density of the particles to decrease dramatically. What we can do for that is add a cube and scale it up, tab into edit mode and select the area of the cube we want the particles in. Make sure that your plane is completely covered by the cube because that might result in some computing errors. And go over to the physics settings of the cube and add a collision. If you simply want to kill the particles, which is probably the best idea here, you just select kill particles and Blender does not have to compute the particles that are way outside our region. So if we calculate this again, let's turn this up just to make it more visible. Get the Brownian motion up to, where is it? Force, there. 3. You can see the particles are wiggling, but once they hit the cube, they get killed, which is a good idea for us. Okay, for now, let's turn down the Brownian to 0, the drag up to 0.2, and the damping also to 0.2. This will be effective later on when we add the force fields. So it's always a good idea to make a volume to limit your particle system, just in case some particles escape and they produce very high numbers in x direction or in any direction. They might cause programs to crash. So having this volume around it that will limit the particles to this space, you will have it a lot. You have a much more stable process, and it might even save you some computer time. Good. For now, hide the cube, because if we go into solid mode, everything will be hidden. So press H to hide the cube. And let's add some force fields. First of all, I'll add Shift A, add a force field, just a force. And I almost always use the minimum and the maximum values. So use the maximum and just drag the distance until it covers a fairly large distance, and this will cause the particles that are further away from the animal to come closer. And also let's use a minimum, because as soon as they're close enough, I want other force fields to affect them. So let's drag the minimum around the mouth. Nope, nothing happens, and of course the reason is I accidentally added the force field to the layer number 1, and we of course need to be at layer number 2. Let's play this again, and you see the particles are moving outwards, so set the strength to -2, and you see the particles are drawn towards our animal, but -2 is way too much, so just let's keep it at -1. And the next one I want to use is a wind. The wind will blow particles that are close enough to the mouth. It will blow them into the mouth. So press R, because right now is the wind is pointing upwards, and rotate it 180 degrees while still in front view. And let's increase the strength a little for now, and let's see what that does. All the particles are moving down, which is again not what we want, so we have to use the maximum again. I only want to affect particles that are really close to the bell animal. So let's hide this force field for now so we can see a little better. Also hide the light and the empty. Always just select it and press H. And the wind, we want the maximum distance to be like this. We don't need a minimum right now. You can see here the fall off is a sphere, but still if I animate this, you see all the particles are doing something weird. They sort of clump in this area, and that is because even though we have a fall off of a sphere, we have the shape of the wind emitter to be a plane. And let's change that to point, and now it affects only the particles that are inside the fall off sphere. You can see as soon as they enter the sphere, they get pushed down, which is exactly what we want. Let's add the newest and most interesting force field that Blender has so far. To show you this one, I'll first create a whole new system. Or actually, let's not create a whole new system, let's just duplicate this plane and move it over to layer number 3 by pressing M and then 3. Go to layer number 3, we already have the particles here. Scale down the plane because we don't need a field that wide, and press Shift A and add a Bezier curve. Let's rotate this in 3D space a little so we have a better view towards it. There we go. And add a force field that is called a vortex. And this vortex will grab particles and rotate them around a point. Let's again use a maximum so I can demonstrate this a lot better. This should be fine. Scale it up a little maybe. And yeah, scale this down even more, and we need some more particles to show you this effect. Let's take 1,000, no problem. And see what our field does. You can see it takes the particles that are around it and vortexes them around the center point. And this is not the impressive part. The impressive part is that you can change the shape from a point to a curve. And if you do that, the particles will, let's increase the strength and the inflow. And you see the particles are drawn towards the curve and are now rotating around the curve, which is very handy, for example, for tornadoes. Or, in our case, the vortexes around the mouth of our little bell animal. So now that you understood how the vortex works with the new curve function, I'll delete this. Go to my layer 2 again. It did something with them while they were not active, so just press Shift and back arrow to reset them. Okay, let's take this vortex thing even one level further. Shift A to add a curved circle and move this around and try to fit the mouth of our animal. It doesn't have to be perfect, but still it's a good idea to make it fit. For now I'll keep it at this so I can still see it. And make sure it's again on layer number 1, so M and 2 to make this layer number 2. And add a curve guide, not a curve guide, a vortex that is a curve. And this way our particles, let's add a maximum. This way our particles will move around. Let's disable the other fields for now, so we can see a lot better what this does. We'll just move them to layer number 3 for now. And that was the wrong one. Layer number 3. This one's supposed to stay at layer number 2. And let's have a look. The particles are now flowing from under the curved circle to up, so we have to invert the strength. And you can see now the particles are going from downwards, upwards to the vortex, which is exactly what we want. Let's increase the inflow a bit, because the inflow is the speed of which they go towards the position that the force field dictates. Okay, this is still very subtle. I want this to be a lot actually, and this is of course too much. Okay, yeah, let's just leave it at this for now. Also add a minimum distance about this big and see what happens then. Okay. We'll tweak those settings later when we have all the force fields in place. Let's add one more force field, and that is our particles are still very static, and while I was testing, the Brownian motion didn't work that well for me, especially because as soon as the particles are inside the belly, we don't want the Brownian motion anymore because they're supposed to stay in there. So we'll Shift A, add a force field turbulence, which does essentially the same thing, but we can use a minimum distance and put this around the belly. So as soon as the particles are inside this minimum range, they will stop wiggling. And the turbulence field settings, leave them as it is, except for the minimum distance. The vortex will set the strength to -0.8 and the inflow to -1. We should really start naming those. Press N and call this the vortex, and this is the turbulence, and yeah, this is our wind, and this is our big sphere. Okay, press A on everything that's on layer 3 and press M to move it to layer 2, and press 2 on your keyboard to activate layer 2. We have to modify the strength of the force. Let's put this to -2 and the flow to 1, and also the noise to 0.5. And I forgot to set the noise for those as well, 0.3, and for the wind it's 0.6. Also the strength of the wind is 1.5 and the flow 0.7. Let's save this and Shift 1 to show the little animal again, because our wind should point directly into the mouth. Let's see what these particles do now. Alt A, they're moving inwards towards the animal, they're sucked in by the vortex, and we still have some problems. First of all, make the vortex smaller so it won't start sucking where the particles are still outside the animal. Okay, and you can see the particles are going inside our little bell animal and stay there, which is pretty much exactly what we want. But some particles will travel through the wall of our little guy. So let's just make it a deflector. Collision add, and in this case permeability should still be 0. We could kill the particles, but killing them would probably look as weird as if the particles were going inside. So we'll just reflect them and leave the friction Yeah, let's just see what happens. Yeah, as they touch the animal, the outer part of the animal, they just get reflected, and since the vortex is still pulling them upwards, they will try to travel higher on this upper part, but they get stuck there. So let's decrease the size of this, and much more important, this is the vortex, much more important, decrease the distance. So they only start being affected here, and decrease the minimum as well. And let's see what that does. Yeah, it looks much better. Now the particles are sucked into our little bell-shaped animal, and they accumulate there. One more thing that we can change is the weight settings of the particles. And for example, as soon as the wind gets hold of the particles, that is the ultimate force that pushes them down, we want the vortex to stop working. And the way we do that is we leave the wind as the ultimate force, 1. The vortex will take down to 0.6. The turbulence field is fine because it doesn't really interact, but still, just for safety, let's drag it down to 0.7. And the force as well, we want the wind to be stronger than the force. Now this should result in our particles being drawn into the mouth of the animal. Okay. Now you can keep tweaking the settings until the particles that are outside at the mouth, they don't collide with the wall anymore, but that is a lot of tweaking and consumes a lot of time, so I won't cover it in this tutorial, but you guys feel free to experiment with this. Okay, let's make our particles a little more interesting. Press Shift A to create an icosphere. And the reason I'm using an icosphere and not a UV sphere is, first of all, the particles are fairly small, so we won't see any small irregularities. And also, if I add a subsurf to this, it's fairly round. And I can show you that this icosphere now has 242 vertices, while the UV sphere has 482, so it will render a lot faster. Delete them both because I usually don't apply modifiers unless I absolutely have to. Add an icosphere and press Ctrl 1 to make a subsurf modifier with subdivisions in the viewport 1. Now I'll turn them down for the render to 1 as well. And make the smooth. Smooth tool is under T again, and set the shading to smooth. I'll press T again because I don't want it's in the way right now. Let's call this the particle, or even the food particle. And to make it even more interesting, let's add a second modifier, which will be a displace. The displace works in such a way that it uses a texture, and let's add this texture. Call it particle material, or food particle again, and add a texture to it. Just use the standard textures clouds, name it clouds, and use this texture to displace the particle. Go to modifiers again and choose the clouds texture here. Make sure it's beneath the subsurf modifier, because otherwise it won't have as many vertices to displace. And you can change the stack order. They will be calculated from bottom to top. Now this is our slightly displaced or a very displaced food particle. Let's make this point. The strength usually is very high, so let's use 0.5. Sounds good to me. For test sakes, I changed the material of the of our plane to halo, and as soon as you do that, Blender only displays the render parts, which are the vertices, and there's only 4 of them, so you don't really see the plane. So I will delete the material, but first show you a way to work around this. If you want to have control over the particle render settings, but still don't want the plane to be invisible, you just go down in the particle settings, select material 2, and select a second material, the material over here, and don't push this to halo but to surface. So this way we'll still see the plane. It will have a temp material that won't get rendered anyways, and the plane is still visible. Now let's make the custom particle. For that we'll select object and choose our food particle. If you're in this menu, you can also start typing in food. If you have a lot of meshes or objects, that will make it a lot faster. And as you can see now, our particles have turned into spheres. They're a bit big for my taste, so I'll just scale this down. You can also change the scale in the particle settings. And the good thing about this here is you can change the random size, so they're not as conform. Okay, now we have small particles and bigger particles. We might change the random size later on because it might interfere with the depth of the particles. Because if you have smaller particles in the front and bigger particles in the back, they will have the same size when rendered, and you don't really see which ones are further away. Now that we've set up the particle systems, let's animate our stem. It's already rigged, so we can jump right in. But for purposes of saving computing time, let's disable this particle system for now. Set the amount to 0. The Control tab to get out of bone mode, and then B to select them all, and deselect the armature. Very important. So let's the deselection with a shift doesn't really work, so I'll just select them new and make sure the bones are not selected. They're not. Okay, let's go ahead and select hold shift and make sure that the animal is the last selection. You can see that it's the last selection because it's highlighted in a brighter orange than the rest. We'll parent this to the object and let's test this. We move around and we can see our force fields are staying where they're supposed to be. But if we move this, the force fields are not moving with the mouth. And that is because the parenting itself makes those objects relative to the center point of the parent object, but we don't want that. We want them to be relative to the mouth. So the way around that is, again, select all of this, hit Alt-P to clear the parent, keep the transformation, and make sure again that the animal is selected last, and now hit Tab to get into edit mode. Now select 3 vertices of the mouth opening, and these will define a plane, and to this plane the force fields are now parented, and by now I mean, of course, if you press Ctrl P and confirm make vertex parent. Tab out of edit mode and test it. Select one of the bones, press Ctrl Tab, and there you go, the force fields are staying in place. The particles, of course, are not, but that's because they have been baked. We'll fix this later on. Now let's just animate the bones. No animal will be this straight in any sort of water, so let's first just select the bones with your right mouse and press R to rotate them. Now press A until they're all selected and press I and insert a rotation keyframe. Scroll forward to 100, and since the hairs will follow our movement, we have to make this movement really subtle. And one of the easiest way to do this is you remember this point. Just put the cursor there, click with the left mouse, and move the animal so that it will stay roughly at this point while the stem is rotating. It will sell the animation, and that is a little more dynamic, but it will still not mess up our hair as much. So make a rotation keyframe again and do a little bit of animation of the bones again. Okay. Select all the bones by pressing A and press I to insert a rotation keyframe. Now our animal is animated. Looks a little bit like belly dancing. If you like, you can experiment, make a more drastic movement, and see what happens. So now I'll press 1 on my keyboard to hide all the force fields. They were only important to make sure that they stay in place. Go down to my particle settings and free the bake. Oh, it's already freed. So what is weird is we freed the bake, but the particles stay in place. They don't move with the mouth, even though our particle group is moving in the right direction. And the reason for that is the modifier stack. Here you can see that the particles is calculated, and after that the armature is applied. So we'll just put the armature in front of the particle system, and there we go, the particles stay where they're supposed to. You can see them now, they're waving in the water. If you don't like this waving too much, you can increase the gravity, the overall gravity. You can tinker with springiness, the stiffness, and so on. I'll leave this up to you. I'll just show you a quick way to drastically increase the effect of the gravity without too much effort. Just select the Z gravity here, press AA until they're all selected, press S and then restrict it to the Y axis and then press 2. Now the gravity will have double the strength as before. Well, still some weird results actually, and especially the gravity below 0 is too harsh, so let's select all the points that are below 0, box select, and move them up a little. That looks about right. Now that we're so far along with the animation of our scene, let's make a first test render. Press F12 and see what happens. We'll get a gray screen. And this can be pretty frustrating because if you're rendering, so many things can go wrong, and this is one of the simplest one. So if you don't get it right away, or if you don't have the experience, you can search for a long time. And let me see how to fix this particular problem. We'll create a new window over here by dragging this triangular shaped form down, and Blender will automatically create a new window with the same content as the window we dragged it from. Oops, that was not as planned. Okay, then take the outliner. Well, select the outliner from this pop-up window. Where is it? There. And the outliner is a great overview over our entire scene, and it's a great way to clean up your composition. For example, let's name the torus animal, because it's our animal over here. Our plane, press Shift 2 to make the plane visible. Let's call it our emitter. And the empty is actually the track point for the camera, so let's call it tracker. And the cube is the one that's the problem. So if you press Alt-H to show everything that's been hidden, you see that the cube is here and it's in front of the camera. So that's why we get the gray wall. To fix this, we can't delete the cube because we need it to cage our particles. So first of all, let's call it cage. Also, we can't delete the faces of the cube, so it wouldn't get rendered, because we need the faces for the collision. We could set the material to 0 and the spec to 0 alpha and the spec to 0 alpha, but this is way too complicated. So let's just, in the outliner, toggle the visibility for the camera. If you if you uncheck the camera, it will not get rendered. It's as simple as that. And we don't need this window right now, so I'll close it again by just grabbing the edge and dragging it over the other window that I want to close. And I'll press H again because I really don't need to see the cube. And before we render again, let's decrease the amount of particles over here to 100 because we really don't need that many particles for the test renders. And let's render this again. There we go. Typical animation scene, well, or CG scene without materials. But we're getting there. This concludes our animation part of the tutorial. We now have created the particles, and in the next chapter we'll create the material for the little animals. We create some plants for the background. We'll use the node editor to get the defocus going on back here. And this will be by far the longest chapter, but I hope you still join me next time when we'll focus on the render settings.